The morning air in Greenwich, Connecticut, was typically crisp and quiet, but for Richard Hale, the silence felt heavy, a smothering blanket of dread. Richard was a man whose life was measured in billions, in quarterly reports, and in the deafening roar of success. His home, a sprawling estate nestled behind ancient stone walls, was his fortress. Yet, as he stepped through the grand mahogany doors just past 7 a.m., having concluded an urgent, all-night board meeting in Manhattan, the fortress felt disturbingly vulnerable. He paused in the foyer, shrugging off his bespoke suit jacket. "Maria? Penny?" he called out, his voice echoing on the polished marble floors. No answer. The usual comforting domestic sounds, the distant clatter of a coffee cup, the soft humming of the air conditioning, the low murmur of the housekeeper, were absent. Richard frowned, a deep crease forming between his sharply defined eyebrows. He was exhausted. All he wanted was a shower and to see his son, Ethan, before the school run. Ethan, his 8-year-old boy, was the sole anchor of reality in Richard's hyper-capitalist world, a freckle-faced whirlwind of endless energy and questions about dinosaurs. He took the sweeping staircase 2 steps at a time, his polished Oxfords clicking against the wood. Ethan's room was at the end of the long upstairs hall, a place usually vibrant with the controlled chaos of a child's life, half-built Lego castles, stacks of graphic novels, and an ever-present scent of bubblegum. Toothpaste. Richard pushed the door open. The room was neat. Too neat. The plush carpet was clear. The enormous plush T-Rex, normally splayed near the window, was sitting upright against the wall. The bed, however, was the most jarring sight. The sheets were thrown back, indicating it had been slept in, but the impression was cold, like a display in a furniture store, and Ethan was not there. A tremor of unease ran through Richard. "Ethan? Son, are you up?" he called, moving toward the ensuite bathroom, though he knew the sound of the shower would have reached the hallway, empty. He turned back to the bed. It was then he saw the object that turned his vague worry into absolute, chilling terror. Lying perfectly centered on the pristine white pillowcase was an envelope. It was stark black, thick, and sealed with a heavy, unidentifiable wax. There was no address, no stamp, just the oppressive darkness of the paper itself. Richard's hand shook as he reached for it. He tore the wax seal, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, also black, with a message typed in a plain, clinical white font. The entire message consisted of one devastating sentence: "You know what you took from me." Richard Hale, a man who had faced down hostile takeovers, survived market crashes, and negotiated with heads of state, felt his lungs seize. The air became thin, meaningless. "Ethan." He scanned the note again, the sentence burning itself onto his retina. It wasn't a demand for a price, it was a demand for a reckoning. It wasn't about money, it was about history. The phrasing, personal, accusatory, and cryptic, sent a jolt of recognition, cold and painful, straight through his memory. "You know what you took from me." The words weren't a puzzle. They were a key, unlocking a vault he had slammed shut 20 years ago and believed was permanently sealed. A vault filled with ambition, betrayal, and a deep, irrevocable error. He staggered back, tripping over a discarded comic book. He fumbled for his phone, his thumb shaking so violently he almost dropped the device before managing to dial the one number he had sworn he would never need: Detective Sergeant Alastair Finch. Finch was his private, off-the-book security consultant, a former NYPD chief who specialized in keeping high-net-worth secrets buried. "Finch," Richard managed, his voice a raw, unrecognizable rasp. "It's Richard. They took him. Ethan is gone." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the window overlooking the manicured lawns. The sun was fully up now, mocking the shadow that had fallen over his life. "And Finch," Richard added, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I know who did it. I just don't know who they are now." Within 40 minutes, Richard Hale's house transformed from a sanctuary of wealth into a meticulously organized chaos zone. Detective Alastair Finch arrived first, a man built like a granite slab with eyes that missed nothing. He was accompanied by 2 discreet but heavily armed security specialists, his shadow team. Finch took one look at Richard, pale and pacing, the black note clutched in his hand, and immediately bypassed the protocol. "No, Richard. You don't call the police yet. You call the people who handle this," Finch stated, taking the note and placing it delicately into an evidence bag he pulled from his jacket. "If we go through local law enforcement first, we lose control of the narrative in under an hour. We need to frame this, or your secret will be on the front page before lunch." "My secret?" Richard snapped, running a hand through his immaculately styled hair. "My son is gone, Alistair. Which is why we manage this, together," Finch stressed, his voice low and firm. "You told me you know who did it, or at least, who inspired the note." "Who, Richard? Give me a name." Richard hesitated. To name the person was to admit the crime that created the enemy. He looked away, focusing on the framed photos of Ethan on the mantelpiece, a gap-toothed smile, a dinosaur costume. His resolve hardened. He had to save Ethan first. The truth could wait. "It's vague, Alistair. An old business rival. But they'd be after money. This note is about revenge. Something I did years ago." Finch narrowed his eyes, clearly sensing the lie, but decided to press the immediate concern. "We bring in the FBI Hostage Rescue Team, HRT, through my contacts. They're discreet. We tell them it's a targeted grab for corporate espionage information and ransom, nothing more. We manage the flow of information." "Agreed?" Richard nodded tightly. "Agreed. Get them here. And find my son." By mid-morning, the estate was flooded with professional efficiency. FBI Special Agent in Charge SAC, Vivian Holloway, a woman who projected calm authority with every measured word, set up a command post in Richard's private library. She bypassed the usual uniform and chose dark tactical gear, symbolizing a shift from investigation to operation. "Mr. Hale," Holloway began, her voice steady and neutral. "We have secured the perimeter. Local police are on standby but not involved yet. We are treating this as a high-stakes, high-net-worth kidnapping. Standard procedure, we wait for the kidnapper to establish contact." Richard sat opposite her, his tie loosened, a mask of the anxious, distraught father replacing the cold veneer of the CEO. "I need to know what they want. They didn't ask for money." Holloway referred to the evidence bag containing the note. "You know what you took from me. This is highly unusual. It suggests a personal, non-monetary motivation initially. Revenge, grievance, or perhaps they view the child as leverage for something you possess, intellectual property, files, or specific documents." Richard swallowed, the dry taste of fear metallic on his tongue. "Documents. No, it was more than documents. It was life." Finch stepped in, providing the FBI with the carefully curated narrative. "Richard had a brutal partnership dissolution about 20 years ago, SAC Holloway. The partner, a man named Victor Thorne, lost everything. Financially ruined him. Richard worries this might be some final, desperate act of retaliation." Holloway scribbled the name Victor Thorne on her pad. "We'll run him. But typically, personal vendettas like this are executed with more immediate demands." As Holloway directed her team to sweep the house for surveillance devices and potential entry points, Richard excused himself, walking into the solitude of his massive master bedroom. He couldn't shake the name Finch had used. Victor Thorne. Thorne was the lie, the distraction. The true ghost from the past was far darker. Standing before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, Richard saw not the powerful titan of industry, but a man unraveling. He walked to his secure safe, concealed behind a rotating section of his library wall, his hands, still trembling slightly, keyed in a complex sequence. The heavy door hissed open. Inside, next to his passport and a stack of bearer bonds, was a worn leather journal. He pulled it out, the scent of old paper and dust filling his nostrils that he flipped past entries detailing early corporate strategies and aggressive stock moves until he found the page he was looking for, dated almost 2 decades ago. The entry was simple, 2 lines written in his younger, more arrogant hand: "She chose ambition. I chose the company. The consequences are hers, not mine. Richard closed his eyes, the memory a sudden, blinding flash. It wasn't about Victor Thorne's business loss. It was about Serafina Thorne, Victor's wife, Richard's former associate, and the one person he had ruthlessly cut out of their joint venture, a betrayal that resulted not just in her financial ruin, but a subsequent and far more devastating personal tragedy. You know what you took from me. The person who wrote the note wasn't Victor, the corporate rival. It was someone whose life Richard had irrevocably damaged. Someone whose child he had indirectly taken that he knew the truth. Ethan was not kidnapped for ransom. He was taken because Richard Hale was finally being forced to pay for the ultimate debt that he had to find out who Serafina Thorne's surviving family was, or who had taken up her cause. He had to outmaneuver the FBI, Finch, and everyone else who relied on his carefully constructed lie. The silence was broken by the sharp, authoritative voice of Agent Holloway calling from downstairs. Mr. Hale. We have a trace on a burner phone. A message just came through. Richard slammed the journal shut, locking it back in the safe. The game had just escalated. Richard descended the stairs quickly, adopting the role of the anxious, compliant father. He entered the library command center where Agent Holloway and Detective Finch were huddled around a screen displaying a cryptic text message. The room was tense, lit only by the cold glow of multiple monitors. What is it? Richard asked, his voice suitably strained. As AC Holloway pointed to the screen. They used a secure, untraceable platform that routed through 3 different continents before hitting this burner phone. It's highly sophisticated, Mr. Hale. This isn't a desperate former business partner, this is a professional operation. The text message was agonizingly simple, yet devastating. The price is not negotiable. The exchange is not monetary, no demand. Richard whispered, not yet. Holloway confirmed. But the message arrived with this. She motioned to another screen showing a high-resolution photograph. The photo was of Ethan. He was sitting on a simple wooden chair, wearing the same dinosaur t-shirt he had on yesterday. He looked frightened, but unharmed, holding a small, hand-drawn picture of his family. The background was dark and indistinct, some sort of basement or warehouse. Richard felt a rush of overwhelming relief mixed with paralyzing fear. He's alive. Thank God. Finch, ever the pragmatist, leaned in. The key here is the timing. They established contact quickly but offered no financial terms. This confirms the note, it's personal. They want to control you, Richard, not your bank account. Richard immediately seized the moment to solidify the Victor Thorne narrative for the FBI. It's Thorne. He's always been obsessive, always wanted to hurt me where it counts. I ruined his life, now he's trying to ruin mine. Holloway made a note. Mr. Hale, we need you to think. What could Mr. Thorne possibly want that is more valuable than, say, $100 million? Richard met her gaze, feigning confusion. I don't know. Maybe some old proprietary tech we developed together. I honestly can't think of anything else. As Holloway began coordinating efforts to analyze the photo's metadata for any geographical clues, Richard excused himself to the restroom. He instead slipped into his rarely used study, a soundproofed room behind his wine cellar that he pulled out a second, encrypted satellite phone, a device even Finch didn't know about. He needed information on Serafina Thorne, and he needed it yesterday. That he dialed a contact number, a man known only as the librarian, an information broker who operated outside the legal and dark web, dealing only in the deepest, most sensitive secrets of the ultra-rich. The call connected immediately. A dry, synthesized voice spoke. Your account has been dormant, Mr. Hale. This inquiry is being logged. I need a deep dive on Serafina Thorne. Richard spoke into the phone, his voice hushed and urgent. Specifically, her life and family in the 20 years since she dissolved the partnership with me and Victor Thorne. Specificity is required. What is the target of the search? The voice asked. Any surviving relatives. Any significant life events that occurred exactly 20 years ago. And where she is now. I need everything. I need it in 2 hours. A request of this magnitude requires a substantial deposit of assets and carries significant risk of exposure. Confirmation of transfer required. Richard confirmed the transfer of a substantial sum. He knew this search would expose his past far more thoroughly than the FBI could ever manage. But he had no choice. The person who took Ethan was related to Serafina's tragedy, and that tragedy was his fault. The 2-hour wait was torture. Richard returned to the command center, acting the part, answering Holloway's routine questions about Ethan's daily life and friends, while every nerve ending was tuned to the encrypted phone in his pocket. Finally, the phone vibrated. He retreated to the study again. The librarian's voice was the same, but the tone was darker, colder. The file is too extensive for voice transmission. Summary provided. Serafina Thorne did not survive the events 20 years ago. The tragedy resulted in her passing. She left behind one family member, a child, born shortly after the collapse of the partnership. Richard's blood ran cold. He had never known. Serafina had been pregnant when he forced her out. When she lost everything. The child's name is Caleb Thorne. Records indicate he was raised by his maternal grandmother in obscurity. He would be 20 years old now. An examination of his digital footprint shows intense, almost pathological interest in the history of Hale Industries and a detailed study of the events surrounding his mother's demise. The ultimate consequence. Richard hadn't just taken Serafina's career, he had indirectly taken her life, and left her child fatherless and orphaned. You know what you took from me. The phrase resonated with a chilling finality. Caleb Thorne wasn't seeking money or documents. He was seeking a life-for-life payment. He had taken Richard's child because Richard had, in effect, taken his mother. Just then, the satellite phone buzzed again, this time with a new, single message delivered directly from the librarian's system. Caleb Thorne's current employment is listed as private security consultant. Specialty, covert extractions. Richard Hale slumped against the cool wall, the weight of 20 years of denial crashing down on him. Caleb Thorne wasn't just a vengeful kid, he was trained, professional, and lethal. And he had his son. Richard now knew exactly who the kidnapper was, and precisely what he owed. He had to face his past, or lose Ethan forever. Richard returned to the library, his face a mask of calculated panic. He looked directly at C.C. Holloway, forcing himself to appear distraught but cooperative. Agent Holloway, I've been thinking about Victor Thorne and that old technology, Richard began, seizing control of the narrative. There was one project, highly sensitive, we developed 20 years ago. It involved early quantum encryption. If Thorne got access to those original algorithms, he could potentially cripple global financial communications. I think that's what he wants. He was giving them a high-value, high-stakes financial motivation, a reason for the secrecy and professionalism that would align with their initial assessment and divert attention from the highly personal vendetta. Holloway's expression shifted instantly from skepticism to intense focus. Proprietary encryption. This changes the scope entirely, Mr. Hale. We need those files. Where are the original algorithms located? They're highly secured, off-site. I will need to coordinate with my chief security officer to retrieve them. Richard lied smoothly. This created a legitimate reason for him to use his own resources and communicate outside the FBI's monitoring sphere. Finch, watching Richard carefully, looked troubled. He knew Richard was omitting crucial details, but the potential threat of global financial sabotage was too serious for him to ignore. Even if he suspected the root cause was personal, will facilitate the retrieval, Mr. Hale, Holloway confirmed, dispatching 2 agents to accompany Richard's CSO, who was conveniently unreachable, giving Richard more time. But for now, all communication is through us. Richard retreated to the study, preparing his next, perilous move. Caleb Thorne was not asking for anything, yet. He was merely establishing the debt. Richard had to reach out first and acknowledge the truth that he pulled up the secure messaging platform used by the librarian, knowing that Caleb Thorne's digital profile would be constantly monitoring the Hale networks for any sign of recognition. Instead of typing a ransom proposal or a threat, Richard typed a single, honest message, addressing the dark history directly. Caleb. I know who you are. I know why you took him. You are right. I took everything from her. I am responsible for Serafina's death. He paused, heart pounding, then continued, Ethan is innocent. He does not deserve to pay for my mistakes. Tell me the price for his life. Not money. What do you truly want? I will give you anything that he hit send. The message, stripped of all identifying metadata by the platform, was now floating into the digital ether, a beacon aimed directly at the heart of his enemy. He waited, the silence of the study amplifying the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Minutes stretched into eternity. He pictured Caleb, 20 years old, consumed by a legitimate, searing hatred, looking at his confession. The reply came almost instantly. It was not a long, vengeful tirade. It was short, cold, and utterly terrifying. I don't want anything you own, Richard. I want what I deserve. Wait for the location. We will meet. Alone. The instruction alone was a direct challenge to the FBI and Finch. Richard realized that Caleb wasn't interested in a trade, he was interested in a confrontation. Richard's mind raced back to the events 20 years prior, trying to understand the depth of Caleb's grievance. He and Serafina were young, ambitious partners launching an innovative tech firm. Richard, the charismatic financier, and Serafina, the brilliant engineer. Their chemistry was explosive, both professionally and, briefly, personally. When Serafina revealed she was pregnant, Victor Thorne's child, but conceived during a complicated period in their lives, Richard panicked. He saw the child as a liability, a threat to the IPO and his control. He ruthlessly engineered a board vote, using fabricated data to demonstrate financial malfeasance on her part, forcing her out just weeks before the public offering made them all billionaires. Serafina was emotionally and financially crushed. She lost her stake, her reputation, and soon after, due to stress-related complications shortly after Caleb's birth, she died. The narrative Richard had perpetuated was that she simply stepped away for personal reasons. He had buried the truth of the manufactured scandal and her subsequent death under mountains of paperwork and corporate spin. Now, Caleb, armed with the truth, saw Ethan not as a child, but as the only valuable thing Richard Hale possessed, the sole embodiment of the future Richard had secured by destroying Serafina's. Richard knew he had to meet Caleb. The FBI would never allow him to go alone, and Finch would certainly try to stop him. He had to prepare his escape plan, a temporary disappearance from his own command center. He looked at the digital message one last time. We will meet. Alone. The meeting would not be an exchange. It would be an execution of justice, and Richard Hale was the intended victim. Alastair Finch watched Richard Hale from across the library, the CEO's posture slightly too rigid, his eyes too distant. Richard's sudden shift of focus to quantum encryption algorithms felt like a carefully constructed smoke screen. Finch had been in law enforcement too long not to recognize a meticulously managed lie. He signaled to one of his shadow team members, a quiet, effective man named Miles. Miles, I need you to double-check the initial scene analysis in Ethan's room. Specifically, the positioning of the black envelope. And then, I need you to start a deep dive on any significant personal tragedies in Richard Hale's life exactly 20 years ago. Ignore the corporate records, look for obituaries, small claims court filings, anything personal involving a woman. But Finch, the SAC wants us focused on the Victor Thorne connection and the tech data, Miles whispered. The SAC is chasing a ghost Richard gave her, Finch replied, his voice a low growl. Richard Hale is terrified, but he's terrified of something specific and personal. The note said, you know what you took from me. That level of malice isn't about lost stock options, it's about a stolen life. Find me the person whose life Richard Hale destroyed. Finch then walked over to Holloway, who was coordinating a grid search of the tri-state area based on the limited data from the photo. Agent Holloway, I think we need to consider the possibility that Mr. Hale is withholding information crucial to the motive, Finch stated bluntly. Holloway sighed, adjusting her earpiece. I understand your concern, Detective, but until we get a concrete demand, we have to proceed with the highest risk scenario, corporate espionage. We don't have time for conspiracy theories about ancient history. Meanwhile, Richard was in his personal dressing room, supposedly preparing to contact his CSO. In reality, he was preparing to leave the estate without triggering the FBI's extensive surveillance network. His house was a smart house, wired to detect motion and breach of perimeter. His escape needed to be analog and perfect. Richard had only one way out, a seldom-used service tunnel connected to an old coal cellar beneath the garden shed, installed decades ago for maintenance access. He had recently had it cleared out and repurposed as a private, secure storage area that he dressed in dark, nondescript clothes, a thick wool sweater and jeans, the attire of an ordinary man, not a billionaire. He armed himself only with the encrypted satellite phone. No weapons. He was going to meet an executioner, and bringing a gun would only signal war. This was about penitence that he messaged Caleb Thorne again, using the established secure channel. I received your message. I accept the condition. Alone. Send me the location now. I have disabled my personal security detail, but I cannot guarantee the FBI surveillance. You must give me time to move. The reply arrived a minute later, the old Hale factory site. Bridgeport. Pier 7. 1 hour. Be precise. If I see anyone who isn't you, I disappear. And so does Ethan. Bridgeport. The place where Richard Hale had founded his first company, the one he had betrayed Serafina for. It was fitting, a place that symbolized his ambition and his ultimate moral failure. Richard moved to the main floor, feigning a phone call with his CSO. Yes, Paul, the drive is in the usual place. I need you to prep the retrieval team, but I'll handle the access sequence myself. It's too sensitive. I'll drive out to the off-site facility immediately. He grabbed his keys and headed toward the side door leading to the garage. Finch intercepted him, his massive frame blocking the way. Richard. You are a flight risk and a high-value target. You are not leaving this property. We are the negotiators, you are the asset. Alistair, if I don't retrieve this data now, the kidnappers might use it against me, or the global economy. This is the leverage they want, Richard argued, putting on a performance of professional necessity. They haven't made a demand yet, but if they think I'm stalling on the one thing I offered up, Ethan is dead. I am going to the off-site facility, alone. I need you to ensure no one follows me. Finch looked into Richard's eyes, searching for the crack in the armor. He saw fear, but also a dangerous, desperate determination. He knew Richard was lying about the destination, but he also knew that obstructing the movement of the father in a kidnapping case could have disastrous consequences if the child was harmed. Fine, Finch conceded, stepping aside, his voice low. You take the vehicle with the tracer enabled. We track you digitally, but we won't follow physically. We'll hold the FBI back. If you deviate from the route to the facility, Richard, I am bringing everyone down on you. Richard nodded, his thanks brief. He knew exactly how to deal with the tracer. He drove his sedan into the garage, but instead of taking the main exit, he pulled the car onto the old hydraulic lift. As the car ascended, he swiftly disarmed the tracer unit beneath the dashboard, placing the small blinking device on the roof of his other car, a pristine vintage convertible, before lowering the lift. He then sprinted toward the garden shed, vanishing through the inconspicuous side door. The FBI and Finch, tracking the blinking red light moving slowly down the main driveway in the convertible, believed Richard was heading toward his secure facility in upstate New York. Richard Hale, meanwhile, was underground, shedding his life of privilege and heading toward a rendezvous with the consequences of his ambition in the grimy darkness of Bridgeport. The debt collector was waiting. The drive from Greenwich to Bridgeport was a study in contrasts. Richard Hale, accustomed to the plush, climate-controlled bubble of his existence, navigated the back roads in a borrowed, unremarkable utility vehicle he had stored in the coal cellar. The FBI, led by Holloway and Finch, were now chasing the signal from the tracker, convinced Richard was heading north to his supposed vault. Richard's mind was a frantic mix of self-loathing and determined focus. Every street he passed, every dark warehouse, was a reminder of the industrial landscape of his early success built on Serafina Thorne's back. He saw Caleb not as a monster, but as a mirror reflecting his own monstrous past actions. As he approached the decaying waterfront of Bridgeport, the air grew thick with the smell of brine and rust. He found the old Hale factory site, a massive, derelict structure looming over the water, its shattered windows like empty eyesores. Pier 7 was exactly as Caleb had described, a rickety wooden dock stretching out into the black harbor water, barely supported by barnacle-crusted pilings. There was a single, dim utility light buzzing overhead, casting long, distorted shadows. Richard parked the truck a respectful distance away and stepped out. The cold night air immediately cut through his sweater. He was alone, Caleb. Richard called out into the vast, echoing silence. I'm here. I came alone. A figure emerged from the deep shadow of an overturned shipping container near the pier entrance. He was young, exactly as the librarian's report suggested, around 20, but his stance was rigid and seasoned. He was tall, lean, and dressed in dark tactical clothing, his face half obscured by the dim light, but Richard could make out the hard, unforgiving set of his jaw. This was Caleb Thorne. He held no obvious weapon, but his control was palpable. You're late, Richard. Caleb's voice was low, devoid of emotion, the voice of someone who had practiced this moment for years. I had to lose the surveillance, Richard explained, walking slowly forward, hands open and visible. The FBI is watching my every move. They don't know who you are, or why you took him. They don't need to know, Caleb countered, taking a slow step onto the pier. The old wood groaned under his weight. Only you need to know. You finally admit it, then. That you destroyed my mother. Yes, Richard admitted, the word tasting like ash. Serafina. I betrayed her ambition, her trust, and I fabricated the data that led to her ruin. The stress, the tragedy of it all. I know it led to her death shortly after your birth. It was my fault. I accept full responsibility. He watched Caleb's face for any sign of softening, any crack in the facade. There was none. Only a quiet, terrifying certainty. Admitting it is the first step, Caleb said, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips. But it's not enough. You destroyed my life. I grew up with a broken, grieving father and the ghost of a mother I never knew, all because you prioritized your stock price over a human life. Richard felt a wave of cold dread. What do you want, Caleb? The algorithms? The company? I'll sign everything over to you. I'll make sure Victor is taken care of. Just let Ethan go. He is innocent. Caleb shook his head, looking out at the dark water. You misunderstood the note, Richard. I don't want your money or your empire. I want balance. He finally reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, rugged tablet. He tapped the screen and held it up. It showed a live video feed. Ethan was asleep on a small cot, bundled up in a blanket. An older man, presumably Victor Thorne, now frail and tired, sitting quietly next to him. Ethan is fine. He is sleeping now. My father is looking after him. Unlike you, Richard, we will not harm the child. Caleb lowered the tablet. But the exchange must be fair. Caleb walked to a heavy chain affixed to the pier and pulled on it. Slowly, a large, waterproof chest was dragged up from the water. He opened the latch and lifted out a simple, black document folder. 20 years ago, you used a stack of fabricated documents to ruin my mother's reputation and steal her patents. You locked those papers away and buried the truth. Caleb threw the folder onto the pier. It slid to a stop at Richard's feet. That is the proof of your crime. The original board filings and forged signatures. And what is the price? Richard asked, bracing himself. Caleb looked directly into Richard's eyes, the hatred burning clean and sharp. The price is not that document, Richard. The price is you. You are going to sign a confession, a full, public document detailing your corporate fraud, your betrayal of Serafina Thorne, and the full extent of your guilt in her death. You will surrender yourself to the authorities, and you will face the consequences, ruin, prison, and the complete destruction of the empire you built on her grave. Caleb paused for effect, his final demand hanging in the toxic air. You sign your life away. When the document is verified and officially filed tomorrow morning, Ethan goes free. If you try to warn the authorities, if you bring the FBI into this, or if you refuse to sign, Ethan stays with me. You destroyed my family, I will take yours. That is the exchange. Richard looked at the document folder at his feet, the key to his complete and utter annihilation. He had come prepared to pay money, to trade assets, even to sacrifice his life, but Caleb wanted something far more brutal. The public, irreversible surrender of his carefully constructed identity. Richard stood on Pier 7, staring at the black folder, the cold wind whipping around him. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of lies and money. Now, Caleb Thorne was demanding he tear it down with his own hands. Ruin, prison, public shame, it was a fate far worse than a simple death, but it was the only path back to his son. I will sign it, Richard said, his voice husky with defeat. Bring the confession. But I need proof that Ethan will be released immediately upon filing. Caleb nodded once, a gesture of grim satisfaction. He pulled a second, heavier binder from the waterproof chest. The confession is notarized and ready, Caleb stated. It contains the full disclosure of the fraud, the dates, the names of the co-conspirators, and your acknowledgement of the circumstances surrounding my mother's death. It also contains the exact location where Ethan will be found tomorrow at 9 a.m., in an accessible, public space, after the filing is confirmed by a third party. He opened the binder. Inside was a lengthy, professionally drafted legal document. Next to it was a pen. Richard didn't hesitate. He knew Caleb's training suggested professionalism. Caleb would honor the agreement to secure the confession, which was his ultimate goal. Richard knelt down on the cold, splintered wood and began to read, his eyes scanning for any hidden clause. There were none. It was a simple, brutal contract of surrender. He lifted the pen, his hand shaking as he signed the documents. Richard Hale, CEO, father, and now, admitted criminal. Each stroke of the pen was a nail in the coffin of his empire. The first copy is for you to file, Caleb said, taking the signed pages. It needs to be with my legal contact by 6 a.m. They will confirm the filing with the state and the media at 8:45 a.m. If the filing is successful, Ethan will be released exactly at 9 a.m. The location will be St. Jude's Playground in Greenwich. Caleb paused. If you try to stop the filing, Richard, if you alert the authorities, or if you don't face the consequences, I will disappear, and you will never see your son again. And the second copy of this confession, the original, will be mailed to every major news outlet in the world. I understand, Richard whispered, looking at the black folder containing the 20-year-old evidence of his crimes, which Caleb had left behind. I will make the delivery. Richard drove back, a man stripped bare, the signed confession burning a hole in the passenger seat. He had to execute the final step of the exchange before the FBI or Finch realized he had bypassed them entirely. As he re-entered the Greenwich limits, his satellite phone buzzed urgently. It was Finch. Richard. Where the hell are you? The tracker on the convertible has been stationary in the North Fork facility lot for an hour, but your security chief confirms you never showed up. Where are you and what have you done? Finch's voice was taut with controlled fury. Richard pulled over, knowing he couldn't lie this time. He was committed to the exchange. Alistair, listen to me. I know you're tracking my cell. I'm coming back to the estate, but I need you and Holloway to stand down. I have made contact. I have a deal. Ethan comes home tomorrow morning. A deal? Richard, you left the net. You compromised the entire operation. Who is the kidnapper? What did they want? They wanted justice, Alistair. Not money. I've signed a confession of corporate fraud and betrayal that will ruin me and send me to prison. That was the price. The document is being filed tomorrow at 8:45 a.m. Ethan will be released at 9 a.m. There was a heavy, shocked silence on the line. You signed your life away, for a promise? Finch asked incredulously. For my son's life, yes. Now, I need you to ensure the FBI stands down. No pursuit, no monitoring of St. Jude's Playground. If they interfere, Caleb Thorne will make sure my confession is leaked globally. and they will lose Ethan for good. Richard arrived back at his estate, slipping through the service tunnel just as Finch and Holloway were realizing their containment had been breached. That he walked into the library and placed the black folder, containing the original damning evidence, and the signed confession, Caleb's copy for filing, on the central table. Holloway stared at the documents, her face pale. "Mr. Hale, you've just committed a felony by negotiating outside federal protocol, and you may have just walked into a trap. This confession, if this is legitimate, it's a full admission of major corporate crime." "It's legitimate, Agent Holloway," Richard confirmed, exhausted but resolute. "Caleb Thorne, Serafina Thorne's son, has my child. He wants me to pay for taking his mother. This confession is the payment. Your job is now to ensure that nothing interferes with the filing tomorrow morning, or I promise you, Caleb will disappear with Ethan forever." Finch picked up the black evidence folder Richard had retrieved from Pier 7, the original corporate files showing the manufactured fraud against Serafina. He looked at the dates, then at Richard. "It wasn't Victor Thorne, was it?" "It was Serafina. She was the one you crushed," Finch stated, the pieces of the puzzle falling brutally into place. Richard met his gaze. "Yes. And Caleb is the one who came to collect the debt. You now know the truth, Alistair. Now, help me save my son. You are responsible for ensuring that this confession is filed, as agreed, to ensure Ethan's safety." Holloway was already on the secure line with Washington, reporting a massive change in the operation's scope, a personal vendetta resulting in corporate surrender. The fate of Richard Hale's empire was now hanging on the precise timing of a document filing and the integrity of a highly trained, deeply wounded 20-year-old. The hours between midnight and dawn were a crucible of agonizing tension in the Hale mansion. FBI SAC Holloway, now fully apprised of the staggering corporate and personal scandal, had confirmed with her superiors that the priority was the safe return of the child. Richard's signed confession was a nuclear bomb, but it was also the only known path to Ethan. A team of FBI legal experts analyzed the document, confirming its authenticity and devastating legal consequences for Richard Hale. They reluctantly agreed to facilitate the filing through Caleb Thorne's designated legal conduit, treating it as a necessary, albeit unorthodox, exchange of leverage. Richard sat alone in the library, staring at the clock. Detective Finch remained nearby, not as security, but as a silent, grim witness. "You should have told me the truth 20 years ago, Richard," Finch finally said, breaking the silence. "Or even this morning. We could have protected Ethan." "There was no protection from this, Alistair," Richard replied, not looking up. "Caleb didn't want money, he wanted the truth out. He wanted my life destroyed in the most public, painful way possible. This was always a choice between my reputation and my son. There was only one choice." As the clock approached 6 a.m., the official exchange began. Caleb Thorne's attorney, a contact entirely unknown to the FBI before this morning, received the confession document from Holloway's discreet courier team. By 8 a.m., the news channels were buzzing with strange, unsourced rumors about a major, imminent corporate scandal involving Hale Industries. Richard stood by the window, watching the sunrise, the first sunrise of his new, ruined life. At 8:45 a.m., Richard's encrypted satellite phone, the link to Caleb, buzzed with a confirmation text, "Filed. Confession is public." Simultaneously, the world broke, the official filing with the New York state regulatory bodies and a simultaneous press release from Thorne's lawyer hit the wire services. Richard Hale, one of the most powerful men in global finance, had confessed in a signed, sworn affidavit to systemic corporate fraud, manipulating financial data to unjustly seize control of his former partnership, personal betrayal, orchestrating the financial and professional ruin of his former partner, Serafina Thorne, acknowledgement of guilt, accepting moral responsibility for the consequences, including Serafina Thorne's subsequent death. Within minutes, the stock market reacted violently. Hale Industries stock was immediately suspended. Richard Hale was instantaneously transformed from a titan of industry into a pariah and a fugitive from justice. His life, as he knew it, was over. The clock ticked down to 9:00 a.m. Agent Holloway, using a highly disguised surveillance van several blocks away, had teams positioned near St. Jude's playground, the agreed-upon release site. They were ordered to maintain distance, observe only, and intervene only if Ethan's safety was directly jeopardized. Richard, unable to bear the waiting, drove himself to a street corner overlooking the park, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap, a shell of the man who had left the mansion yesterday. 9:00 a.m. The playground was quiet. The air hung thick with expectation. Then, a dark, nondescript van, different from the one Caleb had used before, pulled up slowly to the curb near the playground entrance. The back door opened. A figure, not Caleb, but the older man Richard had glimpsed in the video, Victor Thorne, stepped out. He looked tired and sorrowful. He gently guided Ethan, who looked confused but unharmed, out of the van. Victor looked toward the empty street, a moment of weary resignation passing over his face. He bent down, gave Ethan a quick hug, and then pointed him toward the brightly colored playground equipment. Ethan, seeing the familiar swings, broke into a run. Victor Thorne got back into the van, which drove away slowly, disappearing into traffic. The exchange was complete. Ethan was alone, safe, running toward the swings. Tears streamed down Richard's face. He threw open the door of his car and sprinted toward the playground, ignoring the last vestige of the FBI's command. Ethan. Ethan. Ethan turned, his face lighting up with the most brilliant, gap-toothed smile Richard had ever seen. He ran to his father, throwing his arms around Richard's waist. "Daddy. A nice man made me pancakes. We played with trucks, but I want my T-Rex. Are we going home?" Richard crushed his son in a hug, the small, solid weight of the boy the only real thing left in his world. "Yes, son. We are going home. And I am never letting go." The empire was gone. The reputation was ashes. But the debt was paid. Richard held Ethan tightly, oblivious to the distant clicking of cameras from the discreet FBI surveillance team. He carried his son back to his car, the adrenaline of the last 24 hours finally draining away, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted peace. Agent Holloway approached him at the car, her expression a mix of professional obligation and grudging respect. "Mr. Hale, we need to take you into custody. Your confession has triggered warrants in multiple jurisdictions. We will need to process your surrender." Richard nodded calmly. He looked at Ethan, who was already starting to drift off in his arms, the stress of his brief captivity taking its toll. "I understand, Agent. I will comply completely. But I need 1 hour to get my son home and settled, and to speak with my housekeeper, Maria, who will now be his primary guardian. You can accompany me to the estate. I won't run." Holloway hesitated, then agreed, recognizing that the battle was over and the culprit's goal was achieved. She also knew that the recovery of the child was the most critical success. Richard drove back to the estate, the journey a stark contrast to the previous night's frantic escape. The fortress was now exposed, its secret broadcast to the world, but inside, a small piece of light had been recovered. Maria, the housekeeper, wept with relief when she saw Ethan, and Richard, in a few quiet moments, explained the catastrophic shift in his life, placing his son's care firmly in her capable hands. At 11 a.m., Richard Hale walked out the front door of his mansion for the last time as a free man. Detective Alastair Finch was waiting on the steps. Finch didn't offer sympathy, only a final, damning truth. "I found the records, Richard. Serafina Thorne. It wasn't just the company you took. She was planning to use her stake to fund a foundation for children's education. You stole her legacy, not just her wealth. That's why Caleb's price was so absolute." Richard looked out over the sweeping, now meaningless, lawn. "I know. I saw her notes in the evidence folder. I thought I could build something great enough to justify the damage. I was wrong." He met Finch's gaze. "Tell Caleb that Ethan is safe, and I will not contest the charges. Tell him the debt is paid." Finch nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "I will. Take care of yourself, Richard." Richard Hale was escorted into the back of an unmarked black SUV, initiating the slow, painful process of his legal destruction. The news helicopters already circling overhead filmed the scene, broadcasting the final, brutal chapter of the billionaire's fall. In the weeks that followed, the Hale empire was systematically dismantled. The corporate fraud investigation widened, taking down many of Richard's co-conspirators. The fortune he had amassed was largely seized, earmarked for restitution and legal penalties. Ethan, shielded by Maria and a court-appointed guardian, slowly adjusted to his father's absence. Caleb Thorne and Victor Thorne, using the resources Richard signed over as part of the initial transfer of assets, quietly left the country. They were never formally charged in the kidnapping. The FBI officially classified the event as an irregular retrieval of stolen corporate property by a victim of Richard Hale's fraud, choosing to prioritize the closure of the massive corporate case over the complex, sympathetic case against Caleb. Caleb had achieved his objective, the complete destruction of the man who had destroyed his mother. The story of the kidnapping of Ethan Hale became a cautionary tale, not about the dangers of extreme wealth, but about the insidious, long-reaching power of unpaid moral debts. One afternoon, a month after his father's surrender, Ethan was drawing in the sunlit library, the space now feeling less imposing. Maria brought him a thick envelope that had arrived anonymously. Inside, there was no note, just a small, hand-stitched leather bracelet. Attached to the bracelet was a small, engraved silver dinosaur charm, a triceratops, Ethan's favorite. Ethan held it up, a small smile returning to his face. He didn't know the identity of the person who sent it. But somewhere, Caleb Thorne, having received confirmation of Richard's full payment, was closing the final chapter on his vengeful past, leaving behind a small, quiet acknowledgement that the child, Ethan, was truly innocent and free of his father's crime. Richard Hale was ruined, but Ethan was home, a quiet future ahead, no longer a pawn in his father's dark history. The truth had finally set them both free. 2 years after his dramatic public surrender, Richard Hale sat in a federal correctional institution, trading bespoke suits for faded denim. The silence of his small cell was a profound change from the constant, manufactured noise of his former life. He was serving a 15-year sentence, the maximum allowed after his full cooperation with the authorities and his public confession of guilt that he had lost everything: the company, the wealth, his freedom, and the status that defined him. Yet, he was, surprisingly, at peace. The crippling burden of the lie he had carried for 2 decades had finally lifted. His only contact with the outside world was through letters and carefully monitored visits from Ethan and Maria. Ethan was thriving, his memories of the kidnapping fading into the background, replaced by the normalcy Maria provided. One afternoon, Richard received a rare letter from Alastair Finch. Finch had officially retired from security consulting, now running a small, legitimate investigative firm focused on corporate ethics. Finch's letter was brief and impersonal, mostly detailing the status of Hale Industries' dissolution. But the final paragraph held the weight. Richard understood. I confirmed that Victor Thorne passed away 6 months ago. He was at peace, surrounded by family, in a small town in South America. Caleb Thorne is still operating overseas. Rumored to be using his mother's long-stolen funds, and your transfer, to quietly finance educational nonprofits across developing nations. He used your ruin to build her legacy, exactly as she intended 20 years ago. The debt is truly settled. Richard closed his eyes, a genuine sense of finality washing over him. Caleb hadn't just sought revenge, he had forced Richard to finance the atonement, using the money built on Serafina's theft to fulfill her original ambition. It was the ultimate, poetic justice. Alastair Finch sat in his modest office, staring out the window at the familiar Manhattan skyline, the towers built by men like Richard Hale. He was the only person who knew the entire, convoluted truth about the kidnapping, that the FBI had been chasing a corporate phantom while the real kidnapper was executing a meticulously planned act of moral vengeance. That he replayed the case in his mind: Richard Hale, the arrogant architect of his own downfall; Caleb Thorne, the trained operative seeking justice for a ghost; and Ethan, the innocent leverage in a 2-decade-old drama. Finch picked up a newspaper clipping from his desk. It was an old article about Serafina Thorne's promising career, cut short. He realized the most disturbing fact of the case wasn't the kidnapping, but the cold calculation of the initial crime. Richard had always believed he could buy his way out of any problem, even one of conscience. Caleb proved that some debts are existential, and the price of a life taken is the destruction of the life that took it. Finch folded the clipping neatly. He had always specialized in protecting the rich, but this case taught him that the most dangerous threats often come not from outside, but from the long shadows cast by the past actions of the clients themselves. That he looked at the small silver dinosaur charm, the one Ethan had worn on the day of his release, which Finch now kept as a grim memento of the case. He often wondered if Caleb had left it for Ethan, or for him, a quiet message that the game was over, and justice, however brutal, had won. That he finally filed the case, labeled simply Hale, R.V. Thorn Settlement, and closed the drawer. The record of the ransom note and the single, chilling sentence was now permanently archived, a hidden truth known only to a select few. You know what you took from me. The silence was the final answer. Dear readers, as we conclude this story, built upon the ashes of Richard Hale's destroyed empire and the rediscovery of little Ethan's innocence, we are left not just with the plot of a gripping thriller, but with a collection of echoing universal moral lessons. This narrative demonstrates that a single misstep taken 20 years ago can cast an inescapable shadow that stretches across generations. Richard Hale's story reminds us that there is not only a financial reckoning but a moral reckoning as well. While he stood at the zenith of his self-made success, he was unknowingly accumulating interest on a debt he never paid. That debt was the honor, reputation, and future stolen from Serafina Thorne's life. The cost of denial. Richard Hale was a man capable of brokering the world's toughest deals and bringing the fiercest rivals to their knees. However, the only person he could not face was himself. By ignoring the stone of betrayal he placed at the foundation of his success, he buried the secret under layers of concrete lies. The suffocating tension we felt in the early chapters of the story stemmed not just from Caleb Thorne's threat, but from Richard's 20-year denial of his own conscience. Denial is the greatest enemy in this story. It is a weapon used to silence the truth, yet every silenced truth returns as a more potent avenger. Hale's life only began to fall into a coherent order when he read that single sentence, "You know what you took from me," and finally confronted his past. The message for you: what secrets, what regrets have you buried under denial in your own life? Remember that every unpaid emotional or moral debt will one day be invoiced to you through your most precious asset. True freedom begins with confronting your mistakes and agreeing to carry their weight. Point 2. The nature of true justice. Caleb Thorne's vengeance transcends a conventional ransom story. Caleb was a trained executor of justice, born from his father's grief and his mother's tragedy. He didn't want Richard's money. He knew that money was merely a tool Richard used to cover up his crime. What Caleb wanted was Richard's identity. Caleb inflicted the deepest wound by seizing Richard's power, reputation, and public image, forcing him to dismantle everything he had built throughout his life with his own signature. This was a form of spiritual bankruptcy far more agonizing than financial loss. By ruining Richard, Caleb cleared his mother's name and rebuilt the stolen legacy, using the funds to establish educational foundations. The message for you: justice is sometimes served not in courtrooms, but through direct penitence. If you must pay the price for an injustice in your life, remember it might not be with money or possessions, but by redefining yourself and your life. True justice is not just about punishment but about restoring the value that was stolen. 3. The sanctity of innocence. The most poignant element at the heart of the story is little Ethan. He is an innocent child, unaware of his father's sins, thinking only of T-Rexes and Legos. Richard's journey toward atonement was only possible because of Ethan's innocence. Richard realized that his money and power were but empty shells when his son's life was at stake. Ethan's safety was the only thing that finally pulled Richard's moral compass out of the gravitational pull of money. Richard sacrificed his empire because he did not want to pay for his own darkness with the light of his son. The message for you: define your sacred spaces in life. What is it that makes you human, that compels you toward sacrifice and love? These areas, your family, your values, your beliefs, will give you the courage to remain honest in the face of the greatest difficulties. In those dark moments, it is that innocence, which you are ready to sacrifice everything to protect, that will save you. Point 4. The necessity of the fall. Richard Hale's imprisonment and the collapse of his empire do not signify an end to the story, rather, they open the door to a new beginning. Richard, finally, found peace in the confines of his small cell, far from the false glamour of his former life. He is now, alone and helpless, confronting the reality he spent 20 years running from. This story speaks of the inevitability of the fall and even its necessity. Sometimes, to rebuild, you must first lose everything. Richard Hale held everything in the external world but was completely empty inside. Thanks to the destruction, he gained the chance to reconnect with his conscience and his son. That a concluding thought, this story is over, but your moral reckoning continues. The shadow of Richard Hale asks you, to whom, and for what, are you indebted? What price are you currently avoiding? When will you stop seeking justice for what was stolen from you, and start making amends for what you stole from others? Remember that life, unlike financial ledgers, cannot be zeroed out. The past never dies, it is merely written on the back of an invoice, waiting to be paid. The debt in this story was paid with absolute ruin. What will your choice be? I hope this story inspires you to lift the curtains of denial in your own lives and to begin paying your debts before they accrue interest. Because sometimes, the greatest success follows the greatest fall. Thank you.